My name is Nora Whitman. I'm 67 years old, a widow living quietly in Bend, Oregon. And 3 weeks ago, I handed my son and his wife $13,000 money I had saved for my lifelong dream of seeing Italy. They told me collectors were at their door, threatening to ruin them if they didn't pay. I believed them. I sacrificed, like I always do. Then, one night, scrolling through social media, I froze. There they were, Caleb and Alyssa smiling on a Mediterranean cruise, champagne in their hands, sunlight bouncing off blue water, not drowning in debt, celebrating with my Italy. That was the night something shifted inside me. The night I decided I would stop being the easy mother and finally become the woman who protects herself. After my husband passed, the house felt unbearably quiet. For months, I moved through each day like a shadow, unsure what life looked like without him by my side. But one morning, standing in our kitchen with sunlight spilling across the counter, I made myself a promise. I would save, I would plan, and one day, I would walk the streets of Italy, the trip we had dreamed about for years but never took. I set aside every extra dollar, marking milestones with quiet pride. I imagined Rome's ancient stones under my feet, Florence's art pulling me to tears, the cliffs of Amalfi glowing at sunset, and a few slow days in Tuscany, sipping coffee under golden light. I even bought a new camera, so I could carry home more than memories. To me, that Italy fund was never just money. It was proof that I could build something for myself, a declaration that life wasn't over just because I was alone. My friend June once told me not to let anyone else spend my dreams, and I carried her words like armor. Still, I believed my family understood what Italy meant to me. I trusted they would honor that dream. And then, one day, my son asked for help. It was a Tuesday morning, 10:15, when the phone rang. Caleb's voice trembled as he told me Alyssa was in trouble. He said she'd fallen into gambling debt, that collectors were threatening to show up if the money wasn't paid back by Friday. As he spoke, I pictured Alyssa cornered in fear, my son desperate, trying to protect his wife. The images came faster than my doubts, and for a moment, all I could think was what if it were true. My stomach tightened, but my hands moved quickly. That afternoon, I logged into my bank and transferred $13,000. It was the exact amount I had saved for Italy. The dream I had nurtured for 2 years disappeared with a single click. The next call I made was to the travel agency. I canceled the trip. I remember holding the phone as they explained the penalty fee, the cold finality of it sinking in. Later, I tucked away the camera I had bought for Florence and Rome. It still had the tag on. I slid it back into its box like I was burying something too tender to touch. In my heart, I told myself love is sacrifice, that a mother's duty is to stand between her children and danger, even if it costs her everything she's been holding on to. But as the day turned quiet and the house grew still, I felt an ache that didn't sit right. I told myself it was worth it, that family came first. And yet, a whisper lingered in the back of my mind. Was this the choice that would undo me? It wouldn't take long for silence to answer. The days after I wired the money stretched longer than I expected. I thought Caleb would call to tell me things were handled, that Alyssa was safe, that the collectors had backed away. Instead, there was silence. My phone lit up with nothing but ads and weather alerts. When I called, it rang and rang. Texts came back clipped, vague. A single word here, a half-hearted line there. At first, I told myself they were busy. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe it was too raw to talk about. I tried to quiet the unease that grew louder each night as the house settled into its stillness. Then, one afternoon, scrolling absent-mindedly, I saw it, a photograph. Alyssa leaning against a ship's rail, sunlight in her hair, her smile wide and carefree. Caleb beside her, drink in hand, the sea stretching blue and endless behind them. The caption said it all, a Mediterranean cruise. The picture burned into me, searing hotter than any flame. 3 weeks earlier, they had pleaded for rescue from shadows and threats. Now, they were basking under foreign skies, celebrating with money that was never theirs to spend. I sat in my kitchen, the late afternoon light dull against the countertops, the quiet pressing in. Their world was champagne and laughter. Mine was an empty chair and a dream boxed away. That photo didn't just sting, it cracked something open. And once the crack formed, I knew I had to look deeper, no matter what I found. The credit card bill arrived the following week, a thick envelope I almost tossed aside with the junk mail. But something in me, maybe that photo still searing behind my eyes, made me open it right away. Line after line. My stomach turned. Airline tickets purchased weeks before the so-called emergency. Nearly $5,000 in charges, a Wi-Fi package from a cruise line, shore excursions in Greece, even a champagne dinner for two. Each entry hit like a hammer, and with every page, the story I had believed unraveled further. I remembered Caleb sitting at Harold's desk after the funeral, offering to help with online banking. I remembered Alyssa once insisting on holding my emergency card when we went out to dinner, brushing it off as convenience. Small moments I had trusted, now dripping with new meaning. This wasn't panic. This wasn't desperation. This was planning. They had lined up their tickets, booked their rooms, secured their fun, and when it came time to pay, they reached into my life, into Harold's and my dream, and used it like it was theirs. The silence, the clipped texts, the plea for rescue, it all looked different now. Not mistakes, not a lapse in judgment, a performance. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands, the receipts laid out like evidence in a trial. My son and his wife hadn't just taken my money, they had taken my trust and ground it down into their getaway. And in that quiet moment, the shock gave way to something colder. This wasn't about being naive anymore. It was about facing the truth I hadn't helped family in crisis. I had financed a lie, and lies like that don't stay buried, not if I had anything to say about it. I wanted to pick up the phone, to scream, to demand answers. But I stopped myself. Rage would give them the upper hand. What I needed now was patience and proof. So I began collecting screenshots of every smiling post from that cruise, copies of my bank statements, each charge marked with a red pen, the credit card bill tucked neatly into a folder. I even sat at the dining table with lined paper, writing out a timeline from the day Caleb called to the moment I saw that photo. It felt almost clinical, each detail pinned down so it couldn't slip away. I called my old friend Marjorie, someone who had lived enough life to know when emotion had to take a back seat to strategy. She told me to be meticulous, to hold steady. Her calm voice reminded me that evidence speaks louder than tears. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a shift. I wasn't just the mother they had taken advantage of. I was building a case, brick by brick, document by document. Quiet fury became resolve. At night, I stacked the folder on the counter, running my hand over it like a shield. They thought I would stay silent, that I would swallow their lies like I had swallowed my own disappointment for years. But they were coming home soon, and this time, I would be ready. The night they came back, I was ready. My living room no longer felt like a place of comfort. It was a courtroom. On the coffee table, I had laid everything out in quiet rows, printed bank statements, screenshots of smiling faces against blue Mediterranean water, receipts for flights and excursions, the photo that had burned itself into my mind. I had rehearsed this moment in silence, in the still hours of the night. No yelling, no begging, just truth, presented plain. When the front door opened, I heard their laughter, the careless kind of joy that comes from cocktails and sunburns. They expected a mother waiting with open arms. What they found instead was me sitting upright in my chair, the folder of evidence resting beside me like a sentinel. I started with calm questions. I asked about their trip, about how Alyssa was feeling after those collectors had supposedly threatened them. My voice was steady, too steady, and I could feel Caleb noticing. His eyes darted toward the coffee table, where the papers waited like landmines. I slid the first statement forward. The airline tickets, their names, clear as day. I watched Caleb's face stiffen, the flush rising under his tan. Alyssa leaned back, crossing her arms, already preparing a defense that rang hollow even before she spoke. Then came the excursions, wine tastings in Santorini, a snorkeling trip off the coast of Mykonos, spa packages billed in euros, each receipt a knife, each detail carving away the lies. I could feel my hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the force of holding myself steady. Inside, I was screaming, how could my own son look me in the eye and invent a story about debt and danger? How could Alyssa, who once smiled at me across Thanksgiving dinners, take my trust and turn it into fuel for her games? But I didn't let it spill out. I let the silence do the cutting. Caleb tried to minimize. He muttered about mistakes, about confusion, about needing just a little help to get through a rough patch. Alyssa rolled her eyes, deflecting with half-truths about booking errors and mix-ups with cards. But each word fell flat against the cold paper I laid before them. Finally, I pushed forward the photo, Alyssa on the deck of the cruise ship, sun on her skin, cocktail in her hand, Caleb beside her with his arm around her waist, the Mediterranean behind them, glittering like a dream I had once saved for. I whispered inside myself, "This is what my sacrifice bought." The room went quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. I looked at my son and felt something break, not the love, but the illusion that love meant giving without end. I told them, in words sharper than any raised voice, that I was done being the mother they could twist. I laid out each fact, each charge, each betrayal, and then I let the weight of it hang. For the first time, they looked small in my living room, not children, not partners, but guilty faces caught under a light they could no longer dim. I ended with my terms, my voice calm and cold. The boundaries I was about to set would not bend. They thought they knew me as the mother who would always fold, who would always choose peace over conflict. But that night, in my living room, the balance shifted, and as I leaned back in my chair, I felt it deep in my bones. This was no longer their stage. It was mine. Next came the boundaries, and this time, they would have teeth. The living room hung heavy after the confrontation. Papers still lay scattered across the table. The photo of the cruise staring up at us like proof carved in stone. Caleb shifted in his seat. Alyssa's arms folded tight, but I stayed still. My voice, when it came, was low and steady. I told them exactly what was going to happen. They owed me every dollar. The $13,000 I gave them under the lie of desperation. The $5,000 they bled from my credit card. $18,000 in total. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was the condition for ever standing in my house again. I laid it out plain repayment, in full. If they couldn't manage that, then I would take the next step, legal action. Small claims court, fraud reports, whatever it took. For the first time in years, I watched my son's face twist, not in control, but in shock. He was realizing his mother was no longer his safety net. Inside, my heart ached. I wanted to scream that I raised him better, that Alyssa had turned him into a man I barely recognized. But I kept that ache buried. Calm words cut deeper than rage. I told them there would be no more second chances, no more sacrifices stolen from me under the name of love. The woman they thought they could lean on until she broke was gone. In her place sat someone who had finally drawn her line in the sand. The silence after my words was sharp enough to slice. I thought it would end there, me with my terms, them with their shame. But then Alyssa leaned forward, her eyes hard, her mouth curling into something sharp. And what she said next would split the air wide open. It came out of her like a spark on dry tinder, Alyssa's voice, sharp and cold, cutting through the silence. She said the money wasn't theft, it wasn't even wrong, it was only an advance on inheritance. For a moment, the words didn't land. My ears caught them, but my mind rejected them, like a foreign language I couldn't translate. An advance? On inheritance? I sat frozen in my chair, the weight of those words pressing against me until I could hardly breathe. Caleb didn't argue, didn't correct her. He just sat there, eyes lowered, as if silence could shield him from the ugliness spilling into the room. And in that silence, I understood more than I wanted to. This wasn't a slip of desperation. This was belief. They thought they were entitled to my life's work, my husband's legacy, my dream. I thought of Harold, his hands calloused from years of labor, his voice steady when he'd tell me that honesty was the only thing you could carry with you into the grave. He'd lived his whole life proving that values mattered more than shortcuts. And now, here was Alyssa, standing in the same room he once built with love, declaring that theft was her right because one day I'd die. It was surreal, ugly, final. The last illusion burned away. They may share my bloodline, but they don't share my values. And in that moment, I made a vow, quiet but absolute. They would never again have a key to my accounts, my dreams, or my legacy. Whatever future I had left, it would no longer belong to people who saw me only as an open wallet waiting for the day I closed my eyes. The days after that confrontation felt both heavy and strangely clear. I called my lawyer and set an appointment, sitting across from him in his quiet office. I explained what I needed my will rewritten. Caleb and Alyssa removed, their names, once penciled in with love, were now struck out with finality. We drafted the new documents carefully. My estate, what Harold and I built with decades of work and sacrifice, would no longer funnel into the hands of those who treated it like an entitlement. Instead, I redirected it towards something that carried meaning. Emily, my granddaughter, bright-eyed and innocent, would have her education secured. The rest would go to a local charity that Harold and I once supported, a small organization that put books in the hands of children. As I signed the papers, a wave of grief washed through me. Cutting my son out of my legacy felt like cutting a piece of my own flesh. But beneath that grief was something sturdier relief, even pride. I could almost hear Harold's voice telling me I'd done the right thing, reminding me that love without boundaries becomes surrender. And surrender is not what we worked for. Legacy isn't just about blood. It's about values, about making sure the story of who you are doesn't get rewritten by those who never understood it. When I walked out of that office, the weight I carried wasn't the same. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer held my tomorrow hostage. That part was mine again. And soon, the consequences of that decision would ripple outward, landing squarely at Caleb and Alyssa's feet. When Caleb and Alyssa learned what I had done, the storm came fast. Caleb's voice carried anger, almost disbelief, as though my decision was some act of cruelty instead of consequence. Alyssa, of course, wrapped it in denial, insisting I was being manipulated, unfair, ungrateful for all their so-called efforts. But the words that stung the most were the silences that followed. My son, my only boy, chose distance over reflection. The calls stopped. The visits ended. What lingered was a silence far heavier than any shouting match. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. A mother always hopes, deep down, that her child will come back to her with understanding. I had dreamed of a family where love and respect traveled both ways. But in the end, I realized I wasn't mourning the people they were. I was mourning the family I had wished them to be. And yet, alongside that grief came relief. For the first time in years, I felt unshackled from the cycle of manipulation. The weight of their entitlement was gone. My choices, my resources, my peace, they were mine again. And knowing Emily's future would be safeguarded gave me strength. She deserved better than broken promises and reckless hands. Justice, I've learned, rarely feels clean. Sometimes it feels lonely, like sitting at a dinner table with one too many empty chairs. But strength isn't measured by who still claps for you. It's measured by standing firm when no one does. As I sat in my quiet kitchen, I realized the storm had passed. The air, though heavy with loss, carried a strange clarity. It was time to breathe again, to step beyond the ruins of betrayal. And that step would carry me to Tuscany, the life I had waited for. The first morning in Tuscany felt like stepping into another lifetime. Golden light spilled across the hills, touching rows of vineyards that seemed to stretch endlessly, each leaf glistening with dew. The air carried the faint sweetness of grapes, the warmth of the earth, and the hum of cicadas waking with the sun. I sat at a small wooden table, coffee in hand, listening to church bells drift from the village below. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next demand, the next manipulation, the next sacrifice. I was simply still. I had dreamed of this trip with Harold, whispered about it late at night when we were younger, and saved for it with trembling hope after he passed. And now, after everything, after betrayal, silence, loss, it was mine, not shared under obligation, not stolen away, but claimed by choice. Each day I walked through Florence's cobblestone streets, stood in awe before art older than my country, and let myself feel small in the best possible way. Each night, I watched the Tuscan sky burn pink and gold, reminding me that beauty endures even after storms. I realized that living for myself wasn't selfish. It was survival. It was respect for Harold's memory, for my granddaughter's future, for the woman I still was at 67. I had lost illusions, but what I gained was truer freedom, peace, and a self I thought I had buried under years of sacrifice. And as I raised a glass of Chianti to the sunset one evening, I knew this wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of a life I had waited for. Which leads me to the lesson I carried home, the one I want to leave with you. When I look back on this journey, it feels like a story written in two halves. The first half was heavy betrayal, silence, the ache of realizing that people I loved could take without shame. The second half was lighter, though not because it erased the pain. It was lighter because I chose to carry differently. I chose boundaries. I chose myself. What I've learned is simple, but it cost me dearly. Love without respect corrodes everything it touches. Sacrifice without limits turns into surrender. And peace, our own peace, is not selfish to guard. It is survival. It is the oxygen mask we have to put on first if we want to breathe at all. For me, protecting that peace meant saying no, even to my own blood. It meant rewriting my will, walking away from illusions, and reclaiming the dream Harold and I had once whispered about. For you, it might mean something different. Maybe it's saying no to a sibling who always asks for more, or finally setting a line with a parent who still sees you as a child, or even learning to forgive yourself for the years you gave away too freely. I can't tell you exactly where your boundary lies. Only you know that. But I can tell you this: when you finally draw it, when you stop letting others write over your life, something changes. You stop shrinking. You stop waiting. You start living. If my story struck a chord with you, if you've faced your own family drama, or if you've ever had to stand tall for your own dignity, share your thoughts below. I'd love to know what you've learned, too. And if you found strength in my journey, pass it along. Like, share, comment. Not just for me, but for anyone else who needs to hear that it's never too late to protect your peace, to reclaim your tomorrow. Because at the end of the day, boundaries aren't walls. They're the bridges that carry us back to ourselves.